It's a pleasure to join you once again to share my thoughts and observations on the timely and highly complex topic of globally oriented leadership, strategies, and results. Let me begin by thanking our good friend Dr. Miguel Cardenas, the International Training Center's dedicated executive director, who continues to be a strong international advocate and role model for progressive topics and discussions. Today we're going to talk about the most significant dimension of the globalization movement, and yet I believe it is the most important element of the globalization movement that is transforming our world, because without it, very little happens. I'm talking, of course, about leadership. As part of our discussion today, we will explore two dimensions of global leadership. First, I will share with you my perspective on the role of nations and the world's largest companies as leaders in the globalization movement. Specifically, we'll discuss how a small group of nations are changing the way the world does business and the responsibilities these nations have to raise the quality of life for all citizens of the world. In another module or segment, I will share with you 4 essential attributes of globally oriented leadership and what is required of today's leaders as we transition from a local management perspective to a global leadership perspective. I think the importance of this topic is rather significant, since the globalization movement will most certainly affect you, your family, your national economy, and how you perform your work. Let me note at the outset of our discussion that there are many people and organizations that are critical of the globalization movement. Much of the criticism to globalization is based on the concerns that the rich will get richer and the poor will get poorer. From the perspective of underdeveloped nations and those emerging economies around the world, these arguments have merit, and I think they need to be addressed by the major players, especially when you examine where the world's wealth is currently concentrated. So let's begin our discussion on global leadership by examining how the world currently operates from an economic, political, and military perspective. Because these are the 3 factors that define power and control in the globalization movement and the world marketplace. From an economic perspective, there is universal consensus that a small number of very powerful countries control the economic fate of the world. These economic leaders have established their power base because they are home to many of the most powerful corporations in the world. In fact, as of 2007, nearly all of the Fortune 500 largest global companies are headquartered in 21 countries. And of that number, nearly 75%, over 370 companies, are based in just 6 countries. Those countries are the United States of America, which is home to 170 companies, or a staggering 34% of the companies on the Fortune 500 list. Japan, which houses 70 companies, Great Britain and France, which each headquarter 38 companies, Germany, which is home to 35 companies, and China, which currently houses 20 companies on the list of the 500 largest companies in the world. That is a staggering concentration of economic power and leadership. And it also explains why the distribution of wealth in the world is so narrowly concentrated in a few nations. And by the way, for our listening audience throughout the Spanish and Portuguese-speaking world, let me note that Spain is home to 9 of the world's largest companies. Mexico has 5 companies on the list, Brazil has 4, and Venezuela has 1. As we discuss the world's wealth and the role of economic leadership in the globalization movement, it is important to examine the list of Fortune magazine's Global 500 companies, that is, the 500 largest companies in the world. In reviewing the list, you will see that 9 of the 10 largest companies in the world are in the oil or gas business or the automotive business. Let me share with you the top 10 list in order to make a point. As you can see, this list includes ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, General Motors, Chevron, Daimler Chrysler, Toyota, Ford, and ConocoPhillips. By the way, the lone exception on the top 10 list is the second largest company in the world, Walmart, which employs 1.8 million people worldwide. Walmart is in the retail sales business, and it is the most influential buyer and seller of retail goods in the world. Now, as we examine the list of 10 largest companies in the world, we should note that critics of globalization argue that the world's domination by oil companies, combined with the growing gas and oil needs of the top 4 automotive manufacturing companies in the world, forms a very powerful syndicate that is harmful to our environment and populations living near major industrial cities, such as Mexico City, New York City, Los Angeles, and Seoul, Korea. Critics cite such concerns as global warming, offshore drilling, deforestation, and the lack of progress by governments and automotive companies to develop alternative fuel sources for autos, as the price we pay for the oil and auto monopoly. On the other hand, local chambers of commerce argue that these global giants employ millions of people worldwide and provide economic stability and opportunity for many millions more in developing countries. A second point of concern among the critics of globalization is the economic, military, and political control that a handful of nations have over the rest of the world. There are 179 nations currently recognized by the United Nations. And of that number, 6 nations control 77% of the gross domestic product of the world's economy. Those nations, coincidentally, are the same 6 nations that house most of the largest companies in the world. Once again, they are the United States, Japan, Great Britain, France, Germany, and China. Now, if you expand the number of leading nations from 6 to 11 by including Canada, South Korea, Switzerland, Italy, and the Netherlands to our list of most influential nations, the economic numbers and GDP jumps dramatically. Combined, these 10 nations control nearly 84% of the world's gross domestic product. And within these 10 countries reside 433 of the 500 largest companies in the world. By the way, for those of you who enjoy percentages, this translates to 86% of the Fortune Global 500 largest companies list. That is significant in terms of power, influence, and economic leverage. When you examine these numbers, the economic, military, and political leadership of our world is dominated and controlled by just 11 nations. And if you examine the numbers even further, you will find that in terms of global leadership, the United States of America dominates and dwarfs all other nations of the world because the United States is home to 34% of the 500 largest companies in the world. This translates to an economic force of nearly 42% of the world's gross national product, or GNP, based in just one country. So it's fair to say that as the economic fortunes of the United States goes, so goes the economic fortunes of the world. And I think this is why the economic, military, and political decisions of the United States are closely watched and carefully scrutinized, because the United States is the dominant superpower in the world, economically, militarily, and politically. Now, while Russia and China have strong militaries, their economic muscle is weak compared to the robust economic engines of the United States, Japan, Great Britain, France, and Germany. Let's look at political leadership for a moment and how it influences the topic of globally oriented leadership. The fact that the United States, Japan, Great Britain, Germany, and France are democracies is also very important to the globalization movement. Having said that, let's explain how globalization is changing the political face of our world. For example, how will the United States military involvement in Iraq or the Mideast change the political face of the Mideast? And what is the connection between Iraq's vast oil supply, not to mention the oil reserves based in the other Mideast countries, and the needs of the 5 leading economic democracies which consume nearly 40% of the world's energy? And when you consider China's oil needs, with its huge population and growing economy, China is currently using about 8% of all the oil consumed each day to sustain their booming economy. Now, China presents a very interesting challenge, economically, politically, and militarily, for the rest of the world as it pushes forward with its globalization efforts. As the Mandarin Chinese symbols suggest, these challenges pose both danger and opportunity for the rest of the world. Let me address how I think China will be forced to change its ways if it expects to be a dominant player on the world economic stage and a recognized global leader. First of all, while China operates under communist rule, it is gradually changing its form of governance. This change it's very slow and subtle, but it is happening because China wants to sustain its growing economy and be welcomed and respected on the global stage. Currently, China has a place on the world stage due to its size and its economic needs. But it does not yet command the understanding of the global community because it has not changed its centralized form of government, nor has it embraced environmental policies and safeguards that most developed nations have adopted. To gain this world understanding and acceptance, China realizes it must shift to a more open form of government in which the decision-making power for economic and military matters resides in an expanding governing council that reflects a broader representation of its population and economic interest. Eventually, over the next 10 to 20 years, I anticipate that China will expand and liberalize its governance to gain acceptance and credibility on the world stage. Certainly, China's military will continue to influence military and political decisions. But I believe the Chinese military role will assume more of a defensive posture and be less aggressive towards neighboring countries in order to gain the respect and support of the economic leaders around the world. Without their support, China will not be able to gain access to the goods and services it desperately needs to sustain its dynamic economic growth. And as China's centralized government weakens, the economic ties between China, Japan, and the United States will strengthen, and this will give China the platform it needs to expand its economy and make it a very powerful competitor. The challenge China presents to the world, and specifically to the globalization movement, is that China is developing amidst two opposing tendencies. On the one hand, the Chinese government operates clearly in a heavy-handed government, despite the ongoing public relations campaign to soften its international image. Now, this is China's traditional public face, if you will. It is their effort to negotiate global investment and host special events, such as the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing. So far, China's public relations campaign has been successful, as the media and tourists have flocked to China. And many of the world's largest global companies who are jockeying for position in the Chinese marketplace have also launched operations in China. But China's leaders understand there is a price they must pay in order to expand their economy, feed their large population, the largest of any country in the world, and play on the world stage. And that price is economic change and government reform. So, in the next 10 years, you will see the United States, Japan, Great Britain, Germany, and France bring great economic incentives on China, much as those nations did with Russia in the 1990s, to abandon its old form of government and gradually shift to a more representative system, just like Russia is trying to do some 20 years later. As China evolves in this direction, the United States, Japan, Great Britain, Germany, and France, which currently control nearly 70% of the world's economic markets, will strengthen China with more economic benefits. And when China integrates more to the global economy, the United States and its major economic partners, as well as the rest of the world, will benefit like never before, not only economically, but also culturally and socially. Today's democracies need to appreciate the great efforts of China to reform its ways and move into the 21st century. Among the strongest allies in this movement is the educated class of Chinese citizens who have studied in the United States, England, France, and other countries, and have learned the benefits of democracy and Western economics. These educated Chinese citizens are now returning to China to help bring about gradual reforms and change. These educated citizens realize that China's centralized government of so many years is difficult to change, and its leaders must create long-term economic growth by supporting new policies of globalization and competitiveness. The world has seen in recent years the difficulties of North Korea as a result of its failed centralized government, and it is globally responsible to ensure China does not make the same mistake. Of course, China's political leaders are quite capable and sincere, and they understand how this global economic evolution is a win-win strategy for everyone. And that is why they are gradually modernizing their rule of government without surrendering national sovereignty, which they have all the right to defend. It will be fascinating to see how all of this unfolds over the next 20 years. But having said that, the die is cast, and China cannot go backwards, nor do they want to. One other thought on China. Although the Chinese government is run by one party, it has experimented freely and very successfully with Western-style capitalism by allowing Hong Kong, Shanghai, Beijing, and Qingdao to operate under the rules of capitalism for the past 10 or 15 years. And the Chinese government likes the results. The Chinese leaders also understand that this experiment in capitalism has been good for the population of China. So, once the Chinese leaders figure out a way to retain political and military control, but allow for capitalism to coexist in their society, they will eventually abandon their centralized practices and change over to some form of more representative government system. This shift will be gradual, but it will occur as a new generation of well-educated Chinese leaders and thinkers emerge and assume power. Since we are talking about the role of nations as global leaders, I think there is another important factor that will affect China, and that is the dynamic growth of India, the world's largest democracy. The problem that India presents to China from a global leadership and economic perspective is this. The economic superpowers of the world are all democracies, with the exception of China. And given the choice, these democracies prefer doing business with India instead of China, because India is a democracy, and India can be better understood and tends to be more predictable. This is one very important reason why India is reaping tremendous economic gains in terms of jobs, education, and corporate growth at the expense of China and other emerging nations. So China faces a difficult decision in the next 10 years as it struggles to keep its economic base strong despite its current form of government that limits its citizens and their ability to think, innovate, and create more freely. Incidentally, I think any nation that is currently struggling to establish a democratic form of government, curb political and economic corruption, enforce globally accepted environmental laws, and outlaw terrorism and other illegal activities such as drugs and weapon sales within its borders, will be left behind as the globalization of the world takes place. So this is one reason why you see such a strong effort throughout Mexico, Central America, South America, and Indonesia to promote reforms and embrace globally accepted practices that will result in stronger economies, more jobs, and a higher standard of living for all people. This is a difficult challenge because it requires national and state governments, as well as major industries, to change the way they have operated in the past. It will certainly test leaders from all sectors in terms of their willingness to share their national wealth and power in order to elevate the quality of life for all people. Frankly, some countries will make it and some will not, because greed and corruption are so deeply ingrained in their way of life. But given this challenge, we need to carefully examine the role of global leadership and how you and I can have a positive influence during the next 20 years in changing the world one small step at a time. This is a crucial subject, which I will discuss in another module. Thank you for your participation. I hope my perspectives will convey a message of solidarity to all evolving nations and organizations around the world that are currently being challenged by the difficulties of globalization, but yet persevere with the hope of a better future for them and for our global society.